So let's speak, before we go to that use case, let's speak about the steps. So the authentication configuration steps, the first step is in AAA, you cannot configure any kind of AA commands before you enable or start the AA process on the iOS. That's going to be done via AA new model command. It's a new model because the A old model was using, let's say, because by default I'm using A old model, which means I cannot speak with TACACS or radio servers, to call it that way. So that with the built-in default model, I cannot speak with a TACACS server or with a radio server. So that's the old model or the built-in model. So if I want to be able to communicate for AAA scopes with a TACACS or radio server, I gotta say AA new model. This allows me to configure the TACACS server and a radio server. So in most codes, if you don't enable AAA, you're not even gonna be allowed by the router to configure the TACACS server or the radio server, because as I was saying, by default the code runs in the AA old model, which means for authentication purposes you cannot use TACACS or radius. You can only use local authentication. So the command makes sense. It's going to be AA new model. Once I have defined that, I'm going to be allowed to configure the TACACS server with which I want to communicate. Now it's going to be a lot of variations. So the method to configure a radius, the configuration options to define a radius server or TACACS server is like 2 or 4 of those. In the scope of the CCNA blueprint, I'm going to use the oldest one, let's say the one which is not most commonly used, but the oldest one which everybody should be aware of. Even though technically speaking this is no longer recommended, because it's going to be aged out by CISCO, because whatever the TACACS Plus protocol or radius protocol support, so all of the new features that are going to be let's say added by CISCO for TACACS Plus and radius for a long time ago, those have been made available only if you choose to define a TACACS or radius server using the new methods. I'm going to use the old method, which is going to be a global configuration in configure mode, saying TACACS server host, the IP address of the TACACS server, and followed by a key. And then what is the key? And that key has to be identically configured on both the authenticator, like the router in my case, and the ACS server or the TACACS server, because that key, that shared secret key, is going to be used by the authenticator to encrypt the payload of the packet, and by the server to decrypt the payload of the packet. So the packet payload is not actually encrypted with that key I'm configuring in there. That key is being used as part of a specific MD5 implementation in order to actually encrypt the packet. So once I have defined a new model, I'm then allowed, I have the option to define a TACACS or radius server, and then I go ahead and configure the authentication. And as we said it before, we have 2 types of authentications, login and enable. And there we go, the commands are AA authentication, login or enable. And then next, what comes up next is going to be the list name, where the list name can be either the keyword of default or a specific list name that you get to choose. Now I have added on the slides the default keyword only on the authentication enable method or list, because iOS doesn't allow you to configure named list for enable authentication, but you can configure name list for login authentication. Now the main difference between a default list and a non-default list which has a name is that the non-default list are not by default enforced by the router. So what that means is, as you're going to see, if for more details, look in the CCNA security bootcamp class. So if you define the list as default, then that's going to by default enforce authentication as that list states for all methods of getting access to the router. Like what that means is that if I'm going to say a authentication list default, then this list is going to define how do I want to authenticate login request to the router. Because after the list name, I'm going to configure the method, which in my case is going to be via attackx plus. So the list name is going to tell the router if the authentication is applied or not by default, and the method is going to tell the router how do you want me to authenticate the user's login. What is the method? And the method is going to be attackx plus or radius or local, or multiple methods can be configured for fallback purposes. So either way, just to repeat that, if you use the default list, you don't have to enforce that around. So if you use the default list, it means that from that point on, for example, all VTI access will be enforced to authenticate as defined in the login and enable list. That's only if you use the default list name. If you don't use the default list name and use a specific name, like whatever the name is that you want, then you have to apply that list on the VTI lines or on the console, depending how do you want that list, where do you want that list to be enforced. So if you don't use the default list name, you gotta apply that list to the VTI lines or to the console or to whatever let's say location that you want to enforce authentication for users connecting to the router for managing it. So if I'm not going to use the default list, that means I gotta go for on the VTI lines and apply the list, login authentication and the list name. If I would want console access to be authenticated in the same way as define the list, I gotta say line console 0 and then apply the list. If I want also HTTP access or HTTPS access to be enforced authentication wise as configured on the list, then I have to also go and configure HTTP and HTTPS access so that that list is being enforced on the router. That's only if you use a non-default list. If you use a default list, then that list is going to by default enforce authentication on the console and on the VTI lines as configured with the method in there. Let's see if there are any questions to make sure that this was clear enough. Okay, no yet, not yet. Authorization configuration steps. So once I have configured the authentication and the user will be able to successfully authenticate, then I may want to provide also authorization. So we have two types of authorizations, exec and commands, and there we go, you have two types of authorization lists. One is going to be A authorization exec, one is going to be A authorization commands. Now the authorization exec command is going to likewise, you have to define a list name. The same thing, you can use the default keyword or you can use a named list, and then you define the method, which likewise you can configure one or multiple methods. I'm going to use attackx and local as fallback. And then authorization commands, if I optionally want to do also command authorization, then I'm going to specify for which privilege level do I want to do command authorization, and I have to specify likewise a list name, default or non-default, and the method, which is going to be likewise via attackx plus or via local or both of them to have redundancy. Now, even if you enable the configure the authorization lists of exec and commands, by default those will not be enforced for configure mode commands. So if you say A authorization commands for level 15 and you define the list name of whatever and then via attackx, then that's gonna the router at that point is gonna enforce authorization of all privilege level 15 commands, but only if those commands are typed in from exec mode, not from config mode. So if you want privilege level 15 commands to be also authorized via attackx plus, because you have defined the authorization of commands via attackx plus, then you have to also put that specific command in there. So without the A authorization config commands, only exec level commands of the configure privilege level are going to be authorized via TACACS Plus. And for safety reasons, by default, none of the authorization lists apply for cancel access. That's as a safety mechanism to make sure that as you configure the authorization on the router, you don't lose access to the router at the console. But if you want your lists to also be applicable to cancel access, so users accessing the router via the console should also obey to the authorization as configured, then you also have to put the command authorization cancel. That you have to be careful with that command, because you can easily, if you can easily lock yourself out of the router. You can easily lock yourself out of the router with that command if you're not experienced enough and you don't know the end-to-end logic of how this works. And then, like in the authentication step, if you have used non-default lists and you want authorization to happen as configured for VTI line access, then you go ahead and out of line VTI 04 or whatever number of lines you want, you go and you apply both the authorization exec and authorization commands list in there. So it's the same process. Accounting wise, likewise, there is no fallback method with accounting. As I was saying, from the accounting point of view, you can only do remote accounting, which means you can account for either exec level or for commands of specific privilege levels. So it's the same command format, accounting, and I want to send accounting records to TACACS for exec access or for commands being typed in of a specific privilege level as configured in there. Likewise, if you have used a non-default list, you have used name lists, then you have to apply the accounting list to the desired line. If you want VTI line access, so if you want any commands typed in at the VTI lines to be accounted for via TACACS, then you have to apply the accounting lists on VTI lines with those commands in there. So now, since we're here, if you followed up with the AA model where we have three entities, and then you followed up on the authentication options, authorization options, and what you're trying to do, then all of these commands actually make sense. As I was saying, and as you're going to progress in your career, if you actually pay attention to what I did in this class, for example, to take this example, to how technology works and what is the scope of the AA, what are the building blocks, what can you do, and why you can do those things, and then you look at the configuration options, the commands make sense. You don't have to memorize them. Like for me, it makes sense that if I want to define a accounting method for exec, the command is AA accounting exec, or AA accounting commands, or AA authentication login, or AA authentication enable. So just by thinking of about what you're trying to do, even if you don't know the command, of course you still have to have seen the command at least once, but then you don't have to remember the command. Just as long as you know how technology works and what you want to do, then the command should be, let's say, like you would have built it. Because if you ask me, I would have built the command structure the same way. There's no other easier way and better way to define the commands to match the technology that I'm trying to implement than the way CISCO did. It's plain simple. Now, verification steps. You can verify the TACACS server functionality or connectivity, so show TACACS or show AA server detailed. There's one more command which I forgot to type in here, which is going to be the show privilege level. So when the user is going to be connected to a network device and has been granted a specific privilege level, you would want to verify what the level is with the show privilege level command. We're going to see that in a couple. And then you want to verify the A lists if the lists have been defined appropriately, which show a method list all. And optionally, before you even connect to the device to get authenticated, you can actually, as long as you have configured TACACS integration, between the router and the TACAC server, then we can use the command test AA group TACAX plus, and then you type in the username and password and use the legacy keyword. It's a long discussion why. Let's keep it simple. You use that command, and then as long as the TACAX configuration is correctly done on both the server ACS and on the router, and as long as of course the TACAX server has been provisioned with that username and password, then you're gonna get a authentication succeeded message back. So at that point you know that authentication should work.